In 2019, a traveler at LaGuardia posted a receipt that went semi-viral for exactly one reason. 2 bottles of water, a small bag of pretzels, and a coffee rung up at just over $22 at a stand that, on a city block half a mile away, would have sold the same items for around 7. People in the replies did what people always do with a story like this. They blamed greed. They blamed a specific vendor. Some blamed the airport itself for not caring about customers. Almost nobody in that thread landed on the actual explanation, which is stranger and far more structural than simple greed, and which applies to virtually every airport on Earth. Not because the people running the coffee stand are worse human beings than the people running the deli on the street corner, but because the coffee stand inside the airport is operating under an entirely different economic system than the deli outside it. Once you understand that system, the $22 receipt stops looking like an outrage and starts looking like the completely predictable output of a business model that was designed on purpose decades ago to work exactly this way. I'm going to tell you why airport food costs what it costs, and I promise you it has almost nothing to do with the sandwich. Here's what's ahead. I'm going to walk you through the actual financial arrangement between airports and the restaurants inside them, a system most travelers have never heard of called the minimum annual guarantee, and why it forces every vendor behind security to price like a monopoly, whether they want to or not. We'll break down why the moment you pass through a metal detector, you legally become a captive customer in a market with almost no competition, something economists have a specific term for. I'll show you the handful of airports that tried to fix this with a policy called street pricing, and what actually happened when they did. And by the end, you'll understand why the $18 airport burger isn't a ripoff in the way you assumed. It's the predictable price of a system built from the ground up to extract as much revenue as possible from a customer who, structurally, cannot walk away. Think of an airport terminal past security as an island, not metaphorically close to an island, an actual island in the economic sense. Once you clear the checkpoint, you cannot simply step outside and walk to a competitor. You cannot price shop 3 restaurants down the street. You cannot decide the burger's too expensive and drive to the place you like better. The only businesses that exist for you until your flight boards are the ones physically located inside that sealed, secured space. Economists have a name for a market like this, a captive market, and it's one of the oldest, most reliable pricing environments in existence. Because a captive market doesn't need to compete on price at all. It only needs to be less bad than the alternative of not eating. And for a hungry traveler with a 2-hour layover, that bar is set extremely low. Every design decision behind the concessions you see at your gate flows from this single fact. You're not choosing whether to shop there because it's the best option. You're choosing whether to shop there because it's the only option, and that distinction is the entire foundation of airport food pricing. The mechanism almost nobody explains clearly is where the real answer begins. Airport restaurants are almost never owned and operated directly by the brand you see on the sign. When you buy a burger from a familiar fast food name at a gate, in the vast majority of cases, you are not buying from that company at all. You're buying from a specialized airport concessions operator, companies like HMS Host, SSP America, or Areas USA, firms most travelers have never heard of, who hold the actual license from the airport authority to operate food service, and who then pay to license recognizable restaurant brands to put on the storefront, because travelers trust a familiar name more than an unknown one. These concessions, companies bid competitively for the right to operate in a given airport, sometimes for a single terminal, sometimes for an entire concourse, and the bidding process is where the real story starts. To win the contract, a concessions company doesn't just promise good food and good service. They promise the airport authority a specific amount of guaranteed revenue called a minimum annual guarantee, or MAG, which is exactly what it sounds like, a contractually locked-in minimum payment to the airport regardless of how much food actually sells that year. On top of the MAG, most contracts also include a percentage rent, typically somewhere between 8 and 17% of gross sales, sometimes higher for premium locations near high traffic gates. Layer those two obligations together, a guaranteed minimum payment plus a cut of every single dollar that crosses the counter. And you've identified exactly why the coffee costs what it costs before a single employee has been paid or a single cup has been brewed. The airport itself is functioning as a landlord, charging some of the highest effective commercial rent in the entire retail industry, and that rent gets baked directly into your bill. Here's a comparison that makes the scale of this obvious. A typical shopping mall in the United States charges retail tenants somewhere in the range of $10 to $20 per square foot annually in base rent, occasionally climbing higher in the most desirable malls. Airport concession space, according to figures reported across the aviation retail industry, regularly commands base rent in the range of $80 to over $150 per square foot, sometimes significantly more at the busiest hub airports, before even factoring in the percentage of sales requirement layered on top. You are not just paying more for a sandwich because you're a captive customer with nowhere else to go. You are paying more because the exact square footage that sandwich is being handed to you from costs the operator somewhere between 4 and 10 times more to occupy than an identical square footage on a normal city street. That difference in occupancy cost has to come from somewhere, and it comes directly out of the price printed on your receipt. Why airports can charge rent at that scale in the first place looks almost irrational on paper, until you understand what the airport is actually selling to that concessions operator. It's not just square footage, it's guaranteed foot traffic at a volume and a level of captivity that essentially no shopping mall on earth can match. A typical American airport processes tens of thousands of passengers a day, every single one of them physically funneled past a limited number of concourses, with security preventing any of them from simply leaving to find a cheaper option elsewhere. From a landlord's perspective, that's about as close to a guaranteed customer base as commercial real estate gets anywhere in the world. And landlords price guaranteed captive foot traffic exactly the way you'd expect, as an extremely scarce, extremely valuable asset. The high rent isn't the airport being greedy for its own sake. It's the airport correctly identifying that it holds one of the only truly captive retail environments left in modern commerce and pricing access to that captivity accordingly. This pattern goes back further than airports, and understanding where it came from makes the modern version harder to excuse as some kind of unavoidable accident of geography. In mining and logging towns across America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, companies frequently built entire towns around a single mine or mill, and in many of those towns, the company also owned the only general store, sometimes paying workers in company-issued scrip instead of standard currency, scrip that could only be spent at that one store. Workers had no real alternative. The nearest competing store might be a full day's travel away, effectively unreachable for someone working long shifts with little free time or transportation. Prices at these company stores were often documented to run significantly higher than prices for identical goods in nearby independent towns, and the practice became infamous enough that it was immortalized in the old folk song about owing your soul to the company store, a phrase that entered the American vocabulary specifically because everyone recognized the pattern the moment they heard it described. The mechanism is structurally identical to what happens at an airport gate. A controlled population, a physically or economically restricted set of purchasing options, and a single seller who understands that convenience and captivity, not competitive pricing, is the actual product being sold. Nobody is handing you script at the airport, but the moment you clear security, you've entered the modern, sanitized, glass and steel descendant of the exact same economic trap. And the $18 burger is simply what that trap looks like when it's wearing a fast food uniform instead of a company store apron. Why airports can charge rent at that scale in the first place looks almost irrational on paper, until you understand what the airport is actually selling to that concessions operator. It's not just square footage, it's guaranteed foot traffic, at a volume and a level of captivity that essentially no shopping mall on earth can match. A typical American airport processes tens of thousands of passengers a day, every single one of them physically funneled past a limited number of concourses, with security preventing any of them from simply leaving to find a cheaper option elsewhere. From a landlord's perspective, that's about as close to a guaranteed customer base as commercial real estate gets anywhere in the world, and landlords price guaranteed captive foot traffic exactly the way you'd expect, as an extremely scarce, extremely valuable asset. The high rent isn't the airport being greedy for its own sake. It's the airport correctly identifying that it holds one of the only truly captive retail environments left in modern commerce and pricing access to that captivity accordingly. This pattern goes back further than airports, and understanding where it came from makes the modern version harder to excuse as some kind of unavoidable accident of geography. In mining and logging towns across America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, companies frequently built entire towns around a single mine or mill, and in many of those towns, the company also owned the only general store, sometimes paying workers in company-issued scrip instead of standard currency, scrip that could only be spent at that one store. Workers had no real alternative. The nearest competing store might be a full day's travel away, effectively unreachable for someone working long shifts with little free time or transportation. Prices at these company stores were often documented to run significantly higher than prices for identical goods in nearby independent towns, and the practice became infamous enough that it was immortalized in the old folk song about owing your soul to the company store, a phrase that entered the American vocabulary specifically because everyone recognized the pattern the moment they heard it described. The mechanism is structurally identical to what happens at an airport gate. A controlled population, a physically or economically restricted set of purchasing options, and a single seller who understands that convenience and captivity, not competitive pricing, is the actual product being sold. Nobody is handing you script at the airport, but the moment you clear security, you've entered the modern, sanitized, glass and steel descendant of the exact same economic trap, and the $18 burger is simply what that trap looks like when it's wearing a fast food uniform instead of a company store apron. There's a second, more recent parallel worth understanding because it operates on a smaller scale but runs on the same logic, and you've almost certainly experienced it yourself without connecting it to what's happening at the airport. Walk into any movie theater and the ticket price historically has functioned almost as a loss leader, with theater chains often keeping a surprisingly small cut of ticket revenue, since a large percentage typically flows back to the film studio, especially in the first weeks of a major release. The real profit center for a movie theater has never really been the ticket. It's the concession stand, the popcorn and soda sold at markups that industry analysts have estimated can run several 100% above the wholesale cost of the product, precisely because once you've paid for a ticket and walked into the building, you've entered a temporary captive market, almost identical in structure to an airport terminal, just measured in a 2-hour movie instead of a multi-hour layover. Theaters famously ban outside food, specifically to protect this margin, the same way airports don't literally ban outside food but rely on the physical impossibility of bringing it through security from anywhere outside the checkpoint. Different industries, same underlying insight, discovered independently and applied almost identically, that a temporarily captive customer sealed inside a controlled space for a fixed period of time will tolerate pricing that customer would reject instantly anywhere else as long as the alternative is simply going without. Here's the psychology layered on top of the economics, because captivity alone doesn't fully explain why travelers so rarely push back the way they would over identical prices anywhere else. There's a well-documented pattern in behavioral economics around what's sometimes called decision fatigue combined with time pressure, and airports are engineered, whether deliberately or simply as a byproduct of how they function, to maximize both. By the time you're standing in front of a menu board at your gate, you've likely already navigated security, potentially removed and repacked half your belongings, walked a significant distance, and you're watching a boarding time that could shift without warning. Under that specific combination of stress and urgency, research on decision-making under pressure consistently shows that people default to faster, less deliberate choices and become measurably less price-sensitive than they would be in a calm, unhurried environment. You're not comparison shopping the way you would at a grocery store, reading unit prices, checking a competitor's app. You're making a fast decision under mild but real stress, about to be sealed inside a metal tube for several hours, and every part of the environment around you, deliberately or not, is optimized to convert that stress into a completed transaction rather than a moment of hesitation. There's a second psychological layer worth naming directly, something researchers studying captive markets sometimes call the sunk convenience effect. By the time you're at the gate, you've already invested significant time and effort simply getting to that point: parking, security, walking, turning around to search for a cheaper option. Even if one theoretically existed somewhere else in the terminal, feels like it would waste time you can't get back, and risk missing information about your gate or boarding call in the process. So even travelers who are fully aware they're being charged a captive market premium frequently pay it anyway, not because they don't understand the math, but because the alternative, spending precious minutes hunting for a better price in an unfamiliar terminal while anxious about a flight, feels like a worse trade than simply paying more and moving on. The airport doesn't need you to be unaware of the markup. It only needs the cost of avoiding the markup in time, stress, and risk to feel higher than the markup itself, and for most travelers, most of the time, it does. There's one meaningful attempt to fix this worth examining, a genuinely interesting case study in what happens when a system built around captivity gets forced to behave like a competitive market instead. Starting in the 1990s, a small number of airports, including San Francisco International and later Boston Logan, adopted a policy commonly known as street pricing, sometimes formalized into contract language requiring concessionaires to charge prices at or near what the same items would cost at comparable locations outside the airport, typically within a set percentage, often around 10% above street price as an allowed ceiling. San Francisco became something of a model case, with airport officials directly citing traveler complaints about price gouging as the motivation and building street pricing compliance directly into vendor contracts with audits and penalties for violations. The result, according to reporting on the policy over the years since, has been a terminal where prices for a cup of coffee or a sandwich, while still not identical to a neighborhood cafe, run noticeably closer to normal city prices than at airports without any such requirement. And traveler satisfaction surveys at SFO have consistently ranked its food and beverage experience among the best of any major American airport. Here's what that comparison reveals, and it's the most important data point in this entire story. If street pricing were economically impossible, if the high cost of operating inside a terminal genuinely made low prices unachievable no matter what, then SFO's experiment should have failed. Vendors should have refused to sign contracts under those terms or should have gone out of business trying to honor them. That's not what happened. Vendors signed the contracts, operated profitably enough to stay in business for decades under those terms, and continued renewing them. What that tells you is that the sky-high pricing at airports without a street pricing requirement isn't a mathematical necessity forced by the unique cost of operating behind security. It's a pricing choice, made possible specifically because most airports don't require anything else, and removed the moment an airport authority decides, as a matter of policy, that it doesn't want its terminal to function as a captive market pricing zone. The $18 burger at one airport and the $12 version of the same burger at SFO are not explained by different rent, different labor costs, or different supply chain logistics in any way that accounts for the full gap. They're explained by one airport choosing to regulate captivity and most others choosing not to. Boston Logan adopted a similar philosophy after a period of visible public frustration with its food and beverage offerings in the early 2000s, restructuring its concessions program around a model that tied vendor selection partly to price competitiveness alongside food quality, rather than simply awarding contracts to whichever bidder promised the largest guaranteed revenue figure, regardless of what that revenue figure would eventually mean for the traveler paying it. Logan's overhaul is frequently cited in airport management literature as one of the clearest examples of an airport authority treating passenger experience as a metric worth protecting even at some cost to maximum extractable concessions revenue, and the airport's food and beverage satisfaction scores improved measurably in the years following the changes. What's notable about both the San Francisco and Boston examples is that neither airport saw its overall non-aeronautical revenue collapse as a result. Passenger volume at both airports grew significantly in the years after these policies took hold, and higher volume, even at somewhat lower per transaction margins, still produced healthy total concessions revenue for the airport authority. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it undercuts the argument, sometimes made by airport officials defending high pricing elsewhere, that captive market pricing is simply a financial necessity with no viable alternative. Two of the largest airports in the country ran the alternative, for decades successfully, and it didn't bankrupt anyone involved. Let me walk you through the operating costs that are genuinely real, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that airport food should cost exactly the same as street food, with zero legitimate difference. Some of the added cost is completely real, and understanding which part is real and which part is pure margin matters if you want the full picture. Every ounce of food, every case of bottled water, every napkin and to-go container that ends up behind a security checkpoint has to be delivered by vehicles and personnel that have gone through separate security vetting, often requiring background checks and specialized airport identification badges for delivery staff, adding meaningful administrative and labor overhead compared to a normal city restaurant that can simply receive a delivery truck at a loading dock with no special clearance required. Staffing is genuinely more expensive too, not just because airport concessions companies often pay somewhat higher wages to offset the difficulty of the job, but because employees frequently face longer commutes to remote airport locations, irregular hours tied to flight schedules rather than normal business hours, and the same badging and security clearance requirements that apply to deliveries. Labor cost, studies of airport concession operations have generally estimated total labor overhead running noticeably higher than equivalent restaurant positions outside the terminal. None of this is nothing. A reasonable, honest markup reflecting these genuinely higher operating costs might land somewhere in the range of 20 to 40% above comparable street prices, which is a real number that shows up consistently in industry cost analyses. The problem is that actual airport markups at airports without street pricing requirements frequently run far beyond that honest range, sometimes reaching double or triple street prices for identical items, a gap that operating costs alone cannot explain, and that the SFO comparison makes almost impossible to justify as purely a function of expenses rather than an available pricing choice. Let me give you a short scene that captures how this actually gets discussed inside the industry, based on patterns described in aviation trade publications and interviews with concessions executives over the years. An airport revenue director sits across from a concessions company bidding on a new terminal contract. The concessions rep pitches an aggressive minimum annual guarantee, higher than any competing bid, because they know exactly how they'll cover it, not through operational efficiency. Through pricing, the airport director doesn't ask how prices will be kept reasonable for travelers. The conversation, by every account of how these negotiations actually run, centers almost entirely on the guaranteed revenue figure the concessions company is willing to commit to. Because that guaranteed figure is what shows up in the airport's own budget projections, funding everything from runway maintenance to terminal renovations. The traveler paying $22 for water and pretzels isn't a topic these two people are optimizing around. They're optimizing a completely different relationship, airport authority and concessions vendor, and the traveler is simply the mechanism by which the number both of them care about gets generated. This is worth sitting with for a second because it reframes the entire complaint people make about airport food. You're not overpaying because a cashier decided to charge you more. You're overpaying because two organizations that never consult you negotiated a revenue target months or years before you ever walked up to that counter. And the price on the menu board is simply the final output of that negotiation, arriving to you already fixed, already decided, with zero input from the person actually paying it. It's worth remembering, too, the next time a gate agent shrugs at a complaint about pricing, that the person behind the counter has almost no control over any of this either. They didn't set the markup, they didn't negotiate the lease, and in most cases they're working for a concessions operator that's just as locked into the contract terms as you are locked into the terminal. The frustration is real and justified. It's simply aimed, most of the time, at the wrong link in a much longer chain. There's one more layer worth understanding, because it explains why this system has proven remarkably resistant to reform even as public complaints have grown louder over the decades. Airports themselves depend heavily on concessions revenue to fund operations that have nothing to do with food at all. At many major U.S. airports, non-aeronautical revenue, the category that includes food and retail concessions alongside parking and rental cars, makes up somewhere between 40 and 60% of total airport income, funding runway repairs, security infrastructure, terminal expansions, and debt service on construction bonds that can run into the billions of dollars for a single major terminal project. When an airport authority sits down to negotiate concessions contracts, they are not simply choosing between a policy that's nicer to travelers and one that isn't. They are choosing directly how much money will be available to fund infrastructure the airport is often legally required to maintain without raising the landing fees charged to airlines, which airlines lobby hard against, or raising ticket embedded fees, which are politically unpopular and often capped by federal regulation. Squeezing higher concessions revenue out of a captive audience of hungry travelers is, from a pure budget standpoint, one of the few remaining levers many airport authorities feel they have left, which is precisely why street pricing policies remain the exception rather than the rule. Even at airports whose own leadership will privately acknowledge that current food pricing frustrates the traveling public. So what do you actually do with all of this? Because I don't want to leave you simply annoyed at a system you already suspected was rigged against you. First, treat the security checkpoint the way you treat crossing an actual national border in terms of your food planning. Anything you can eat comfortably before security, a real meal, a snack that will hold you for a few hours, buy or eat outside the checkpoint, where genuine market competition still exists and prices reflect normal city rates rather than captive market pricing. Second, bring an empty reusable water bottle through security, which is legal at essentially every airport, and fill it at a water fountain or bottle filling station on the other side, something the vast majority of modern terminals now provide specifically because so many travelers have adopted this exact workaround. A single reusable bottle can save you the equivalent of a captive market beverage markup multiple times over across a single travel day. And it's one of the few pieces of airport advice that costs you nothing and works at literally every airport in the country. Third, if you know your route well and you're a frequent traveler through a specific hub, learn which of your regular airports have adopted street pricing policies and which haven't. Because the difference in your total spending across a year of travel through a captive pricing airport versus a regulated one can be genuinely significant. And it's public information available through Airport Authority, websites, and traveler advocacy resources. Fourth, pack strategically for layovers longer than 90 minutes specifically, since that's typically the threshold where hunger becomes unavoidable and captive pricing becomes most costly. Bringing shelf-stable snacks, nuts, protein bars, dried fruit that survive security screening without issue and can meaningfully reduce how much of your trip's food budget gets captured by terminal pricing. Fifth, and this one matters if you actually want the system to change rather than simply working around it individually, use the feedback channels airports genuinely track. Airport customer satisfaction surveys, comment cards, and social media complaints tagged directly at the airport authority rather than the individual vendor do factor into concessions contract renewal decisions at many airports because airport authorities care about their public satisfaction rankings, which affect political support for expansion projects and funding requests. Individual complaints rarely change pricing overnight, but sustained public pressure is the documented mechanism that pushed airports like San Francisco toward street pricing in the first place. And it remains the only lever available to travelers collectively, even if no single traveler can move it alone. There's a sixth practical point worth adding, because it's the one most frequent flyers eventually discover on their own but rarely hear as explicit advice. Airline lounges, whether accessed through elite status, a premium credit card, or a paid day pass, sidestep this entire captive market pricing structure in a different way, by bundling food and drink into a flat access fee rather than charging per item at concession level markups. For a traveler who flies frequently enough, or who's connecting through a hub with a long layover, the math on a lounge day pass, often somewhere in the range of $30 to $60, depending on the airport and lounge network, can work out favorably compared to paying captive market prices for even 2 or 3 separate food and beverage purchases across a long connection, on top of getting a quieter place to sit and reliable Wi-Fi while you wait. This isn't a fix for the underlying pricing problem, and it doesn't help the traveler on a tight budget who can't justify the access fee in the first place, but it is one of the few structural workarounds that exist within the airport ecosystem itself, rather than requiring you to plan around the airport entirely by bringing your own food through security. Here's the identity level point I want you to leave with. The high price of airport food isn't a mystery, and it isn't simply the cost of doing business in a difficult location. It's the visible, receipt-shaped output of a negotiation you were never part of, between an airport authority funding billions of dollars in infrastructure and a concessions company willing to guarantee that funding in exchange for the right to charge a captive population, whatever the market, defined very narrowly as everyone stuck behind the same security checkpoint as you will bear. San Francisco and Boston both proved this is a choice, not a law of physics. The moment they required their vendors to price closer to the street, and those vendors stayed in business anyway, renewing contracts and growing revenue right alongside rising passenger volume. Every other airport that hasn't made that same choice isn't failing to solve an unsolvable problem. It's simply deciding, quietly, that the extra revenue is worth more than your satisfaction, and betting, correctly most of the time, that you'll pay it anyway. Because by the time you're standing at that counter, hungry, tired, and thinking about your gate, you almost always will. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. Airport food is priced the way it is because of a specific, legally binding financial arrangement called the minimum annual guarantee, combined with percentage rent that can reach nearly a fifth of every dollar you spend, forcing concessions operators to price like landlords are watching their every sale because the landlord genuinely is. 2. The underlying mechanism is a captive market, structurally identical to the company store systems of a century ago and the concession stand economics of a movie theater, exploiting the simple fact that once you're past security, walking away to a competitor isn't a realistic option, which strips away the normal competitive pressure that keeps prices honest almost everywhere else in retail. 3. The fix is proven, not theoretical, because airports like San Francisco and Boston Logan have already demonstrated that street pricing and competitiveness-based concessions, selection work, vendors stay profitable, revenue keeps growing, and travelers notice the difference, which means every airport charging captive market prices today is making an active choice to do so. not responding to some unavoidable cost of doing business behind a security checkpoint. The next time you're standing at a gate looking at an $18 burger, you'll know exactly what you're actually looking at. Not a restaurant setting a fair price for its product. A receipt generated by a negotiation between an airport authority and a concessions company months before you ever walked up, betting that your hunger, your fatigue, and your fear of missing your flight would matter more to your decision than the price on the board. Pack a snack, fill a bottle, and know that every time you do, you're the rare traveler who quietly refused to be exactly what that pricing model assumed you'd be. If this changed the way you'll look at your next layover, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.